Thank you all for coming tonight. I wanted to begin, I've been to a lot of events recently that Challenging Racism and Marty Swain's group have run. And one thing they often do is they start with kind of rules for discussion and guidelines. I decided that tonight, since it's supposed to be storytelling, that I would use a story instead. This story is about I have an Uncle Sam who drives trains. And he was in a training program, and there was an older gentleman who was training him. And he's an engineer, so he goes in and he has to do all the paperwork and everything before anyone can get on the train. And then most of the engineers will go get a sandwich or whatever. And the person who was training him said, "You need to stand on the platform while the train boards, so that you can see the lives that you are responsible for." And I try to remember that, not that I'm responsible for anybody's lives, but I do have a responsibility to see the other people who are in the room with me. So if we can just take a moment, look around, introduce yourself to your neighbors before we begin. In terms of the history that we're going to be talking about tonight, hi! The way that this event kind of started, for me at least, was a few years ago. We were renovating this community center. And as part of that, we started looking at the deeds. And on the deed it said, it cannot be rent, leased, or sold to anyone who is not Caucasian. And so it really got me curious about this part of our history. And when we were planning for the centennial, I started asking a lot of questions. I've lived here 8 years. I grew up in Virginia, but not in a place that had covenants. So I started asking a lot of questions. And one of the first pieces of information I got was Toby McIntosh actually sent me a dissertation. And it was a dissertation, and it was so good, I couldn't put it down. It's like, Lindsay's like, what? I just kept reading, like my kids learned how to feed themselves because I couldn't put it down. It was like 3 days later I came out. And it had so much information I had never heard about when our neighborhood was founded, who Frank Lyon was, and what some of the different mechanisms that were used in those days to create separate neighborhoods. So our first speaker, we're going to welcome Dr. Lindsey Bestebreurtje. She's going to say her last name for you. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, that's very generous. I'm Lindsey Bestebreurtje. I work at on the curatorial team at the National Museum of African American History and Culture. My dissertation, when I was getting my PhD in history from George Mason, is about Arlington. It's called Built by the People Themselves. It's about suburbanization and segregation, looking primarily at Arlington's persistent African American communities. I also just want to do a quick, disclaimer, because we had an event where we were all supposed to shake hands, and I had a terrible allergic reaction to pesticides over the weekend, so I was like, oh no, don't shake my hand. But anyways, yes, so I'm going to talk a little bit about the founding of Lyon Park, what the county was like at the time, some of the social and political realities of early 20th century Arlington. So in the years leading up to the founding of Lyon Park, Arlington was undergoing a major suburban boom spurred by the lure of federal jobs and the expansion of railroads to create suburban streetcar suburbs. From 1900 to 1910, the county's population soared from 6,500 to 10,000, and during that same decade, 70 new neighborhoods and communities developed across Arlington. these communities battled for physical space in what we well know is a very small county. They were diverse in class makeup. We had working class neighborhoods which built small clapboards homes, often built by the residents of the homes themselves, places like Halls Hill and Queens City. The aesthetics of middle class communities were very much tied to future aspirations more so than familial need. Middle class communities like Lyon Park were much more a traditional streetcar suburb with pre-platted lands, often very standardized single-family homes created by a developer. And these different kinds of types very much shaped Arlington's early development. In addition to being diverse in class makeup, they were also somewhat diverse in racial makeup. I mentioned Halls Hill and Queens City. Those were both African-American communities. There was also Johnson's Hill, Green Valley, Butler Homes. These were examples of African-American communities, both working class and middle class. So as Arlington boomed throughout this time, developers and boosters really realized that in order to take control of the county, the aesthetics, the money at stake, that they needed to create a system of more formalized control. So they increasingly turned their attention to state and county politics. One of the primary developers at the time was Frank Lyon, who many of you presumably know. Like many of Arlington's developers, he hailed from an elite Southern community. He was born in Petersburg, Virginia during the Civil War and moved to the county to attend Georgetown Law School in 1889. It was there that he met Crandall Mackey, who was another major developer of the county at this time. And the two men had really similar social and political aims when it came to standardization, control, and so they decided to establish the Good Citizens League, which was a social and political group of about 20 of the county's most elite leading men. A lot of the league aims centered on municipal improvements, pushing for centralized water and sewer system, road paving programs, things that definitely will and did benefit the county. But they also pushed, it wasn't for the good of the whole, it was for very specific individuals, mostly for the white communities. Specifically, Frank Ball, whose family founded Ballston and who was involved in the league, said that it was all just real estate developers who wanted to create a residential community out of Arlington. So the league members who were also developers created racially segregated neighborhoods to shape public opinions towards their aim. Lyon also purchased the Monitor weekly newspaper, and league policies were all very much tied up with Southern progressivism, which was a social and political movement of the time that pushed things like temperance, clean living, but also through the specific scope of white families and white purity, fears about integration and what that would mean. And a particular reason why they sought temperance was because often saloons and gambling houses were integrated spaces in a increasingly segregated society. I don't know how many people here have potentially heard about the cleanup campaign of Roslyn with Frank Lyon and Crandall Mackey. a big impetus behind the breakup of the saloons was that they were integrated spaces where people were socializing together. Additionally, Roslyn was home to a working class African American community, and by characterizing the homes as shacks and the people as riffraff, they had a legitimate claim to clean them up and then to take over that land for themselves in order to create new developments. So that was kind of was really where like the social and political realities were in Arlington at the time. But so with this background, you know, Frank Lyon's involvement in shaping the county. He really was the primary developer of Arlington. During the late 1910s and early 1920s, Lyon and the Lyon and Fitch Realty Company subdivided and sold 465 acres in Arlington, which represents about 3% of the total county land. And these were divided primarily between the two communities, Lyon Park, founded in 1919, and Lyon Village in 1923. The Lyon properties really helped transform Arlington's built environment to a continuously settled suburban landscape, and they really sought to control all elements of that development. Lyon Park was a standardized middle-class development. Oh, and when it opened, it was actually the largest real estate development in Virginia, with ready-cut homes made up of Queen Anne, Bungalow, Craftsman, Colonial Revival, and Tudor. By the early 1920s, Lyon Park is a new neighborhood. Arlington County is very much thickly settled with other similar communities dotting the landscape. These communities were also increasingly segregated, and most of the homes had restrictive covenants. So a covenant is a legally enforceable contract imposed in a deed upon a buyer of a property. Owners who violate the terms of the covenant risk forfeiting the property. And most covenants run with the land, which means it's legally enforceable on all future buyers of the property, not just necessarily the single home. And racially restrictive covenants refer to contractual agreements that prohibit the purchase, lease, or occupation of a piece of property by a particular group of people, usually African Americans. Racially restrictive covenants were not only mutual agreements between property owners in a neighborhood, but they were also agreements enforced through the cooperation of real estate boards and neighborhood associations. Racially restrictive covenants were common practice in the 1910s. They became widespread after 1926 when the U.S. Supreme Court decision Corrigan v. Buckley validated their use, and that ruling would remain in place until 1948, at which point they would become non-enforceable covenants, but basically that meant they were still allowed to be there, but like with a wink. It wasn't until 1968 that they were actually deemed illegal.
Questions?
Sure, or I don't know if there's a portion later.
Because Arlington used to be part of Alexandria City, Alexandria County. What was the year that it separated, and do you know the reason for that?
Yeah, so Arlington as a land was originally part of Fairfax County. It was given to Washington to be Virginia's contribution to Washington, D.C. in 1790. It was retroceded back to Virginia in 1846. Then we had our name change in 1920 from Alexandria County to Arlington County.
So was when Lyon Park was originally established, it was still part of Alexandria. It wasn't really Arlington. That's what I don't know.
No, it was Arlington. It was just named Alexandria County from the point of from 1846 forward, Alexandria City and Alexandria County functioned as separate municipalities because the needs of the city and the needs of the county were different. But the county ended up changing its name because it felt kind of like snubbed, basically, by the city. They were like, hey, we're important too. So yeah, so that's why they changed their name. But they functioned as two separate entities.
Arlington and Alexandria?
Yeah.
In 1920?
That was just the renaming, so from 1846. Okay. So yes, so Arlington had restrictive covenants, as did most of the nation at this time. Lyon Park's particular covenant stated, quote, "Neither said property nor any part thereof nor any interest therein shall be sold or leased to anyone not of the Caucasian race." But Lyon Park wasn't alone. Alcova Heights covenant stated that, quote, "No portion of said land shall be sold or leased to anyone of African descent." And in Barcroft, the school and civic leaves were limited to residents who, quote, are members of the Caucasian race. And this racial makeup was actually a big selling point for Arlington's growing white suburban neighborhoods. A Clarendon advertisement from 1915 highlighted not only the community's access to transportation, views of the city, and well-built suburban homes, but also stated that, quote, "not a colored resident within the borders." And Lyon Village advertisements ensured potential buyers that their beautiful suburban community was, quote, "destined to become a community of particular people, as it was reserved for the white race alone." So restrictive covenants were just one tool in the tool belt when it came to Jim Crow, segregation, and suburbanization. Arlington created a host of suburban control ordinances, many of which seemed colorblind on the surface, but if you dug a little bit deeper, it gave, in 1914, the Suburban Control Ordinance was the first countywide planning law. It made all new neighborhoods required to be approved by the county engineer. Since most African American communities were created on a smaller scale level without one standardized developer like a Frank Lyon or a Crandall Mackey, it meant that they were less likely to get the approval. Additionally, the municipal improvements that the league and similar members fought to obtain ended at the end of their community's borders, so it didn't reach these African American neighborhoods, so they were more at risk to be condemned, seen as a slum, the way that Roslyn's working class neighborhood had been. And when the legislation was approved, politicians, Crandall Mackey, members of the Ball family, and the county clerk was George H. Rucker, who was a builder and frequent contractor for all of Lyon's developments. Even as African American communities were limited by these new laws, they still created spaces for themselves in Arlington. We had the rise of some African American builders and developers, people choosing to subdivide and sell their lands. There were existing stable African American communities, particularly Green Valley, Knock, Halls Hill, Highview Park, where people increasingly subdivided their lots, where new communities like a Lyon Park, a Lyon Village weren't open to them. So that was kind of just the evolving suburban space of the time.
Thank you very much. I am particularly excited to see that this is a full room tonight. One of the things I learned in reading Lindsey's dissertation was that the Civic Federation actually was very involved in disenfranchising black voters and working on some of these laws. I did a little more research, and at the time, they met in this room. So they sat in this room and thought about how to enforce discrimination, so I love that it's a full room tonight. So our next speaker is Veronica Dabney. So she is going to talk to us about her community down in Green Valley and her community's history down there. Would you like to? Okay. Okay.
Okay, I have some notes. So my comments are about my experience as one who grew up inside a severely restricted community and the early perception that I was the problem and not the people who conceived the evil system of racial discrimination and American apartheid. We were prohibited from entering schools, certain stores, restaurants, and lunch counters, parks and playgrounds, and even the movie theaters that still stand on the Pike and in Shirlington. It was not so much a matter of who was right or who was wrong, but what was right and what was wrong, and this was wrong. Some people here know that before I retired, I worked for 25 years for the Indian and Native American program at the Department of Labor. For half that time, I was a federal representative, and a big part of the job was to monitor urban Indian programs and reservations. I visited many of them during that time. I was assigned mostly to the Midwest, West, and the Great Lakes area. When I started out on that journey, because some of the conditions were so poor, I told myself that blacks were better off because at least they freed us and didn't restrict us to certain prescribed areas. But soon, upon reflection, I began to ask which was worse. Was there really any difference? I came to realize our situation was not only very similar, but indeed may in the end have been worse. At least Native Americans probably didn't face the prospect of having their land pulled out from under them at the whim of real estate blockbusters and developers, or because the area you live in became desirable because of its location in Georgetown, Southwest Washington, National Cemetery, the Pentagon, and now much of Arlington, including South Arlington. There was no assurance that blacks would be able to retain ownership of the land, and they were prohibited from buying land outside of that redlined area. Native Americans, at least, were allowed to have some semblance of self-government, something that was never afforded to blacks in segregated neighborhoods. I grew up in Green Valley, in the Green Valley community. I lived in what was called the projects, the Paul Laurence Dunbar homes, a community that I heard called that bad area over there near Shirlington, or on more than one occasion by some of the people in my newly desegregated schools, or just around town in passing in everyday conversation. There were actually 3 distinct black neighborhoods in Arlington, and in my small area, Green Valley, maids, cleaning women, butlers, and janitors lived next door to doctors, lawyers, teachers, military, government workers, business owners, and ministers, all of them great role models for the children. To this day, I don't recall knowing any member of the Green Valley community who wasn't churched. That's the next word. Who wasn't churched. If not at my church, which was Our Lady Queen of Peace over on 19th Street, then at Mount Zion or Lomax or Macedonia. And my project community, Dunbar Homes, was actually built to house the families of returning black military men. Every family in my neighborhood housed a soldier or a sailor. I'm very proud of that. Unfortunately, the Dunbar homes were demolished over 10 years ago and replaced with townhomes that are unaffordable for the residents that were displaced. The same thing happened about 4 years ago to residents of Carver Home on Johnson Hill. Today, as you can see by driving down Glebe Road, Green Valley is a mishmash of differing housing styles. For several years, McMansions have been replacing the modest single-family brick and shingle homes that distinguish the neat, uniform appearance of most areas in Green Valley, as well as Halls Hill and Johnson Hill. All 3 neighborhoods were renamed to make them more inviting to prospective buyers. Green Valley was called Knock, as you know. As in other neighborhoods in the metropolitan area, especially DC and Northern Virginia, Black communities are being gentrified with no thought for the people who are being displaced. Since the boundaries of those communities in Arlington were restricted from expanding, the population outgrew the borders that were consigned, and many of the younger residents who wanted to remain in Arlington were forced to move out of the community, mainly to DC or Maryland, because of the stability of the communities, which led, and by that I meant that a lot of the older people didn't want to move out of Arlington, so if you were growing up like I was, and you wanted to move into a better home, they weren't moving because they wanted to stay there, but there was nowhere you could go, because I believe it was about 1902 when they came up with the segregation system. The Virginia Constitution, I think, was changed in 1902. They made areas like Green Valley, they made the boundaries permanent. That meant that you had to live in there and you couldn't expand the community. So we were kind of stuck there and we couldn't go anywhere else, you know. And Green Valley is, I'm getting away from my notes, but Green Valley is bordered on Walter Reed Drive, Glebe Road, Shirlington Road, and 4 Mile Run. And that was where you stayed, okay? Now, where was I? Let's see. Since the boundaries of those communities in Arlington were restricted from expanding, the population outgrew the borders that were consigned, and many of the younger residents who wanted to remain in Arlington were forced to move out of the community. So when I was prepared to look for more suitable housing for my family, of course, the market was very limited in the Black communities. There was nowhere to go in Arlington. But in 1968, the Fair Housing Act was passed, and restrictive covenants were illegal. The street where I eventually moved was the next street over the fence that separated the white and Black communities. A wall separated the 2 communities in Halls Hill. There was actually a wall, and I think the wall, at least part of it, is still there. I think it's corroding or something now, but it's still there. And so when I moved on the other side of the fence that separated 16th Road from 16th Street. And when I moved there in 1969, the year after, the community had already changed quite a bit because I guess during the Civil Rights Movement, people saw the changes coming, and a lot of the people were moving, especially out of communities that were right next to Black communities, because they knew that changes were coming. So a lot of them are gone. So I bought the second to the last house that was owned by a white person on 16th Road. And of course, it had a covenant on it. And my real estate agent showed me the covenant. It said that the house would only be sold to Caucasians. And he said, but the lady wants to move. I think a woman lived there by herself. And the whole neighborhood was Black except for one other family. And so she didn't care anymore. You know, she just wanted to move. And so that's kind of how I got the house. But afterwards, I said what I have in the last thing. But I just want to say that sometimes I say that it sounds like we were distressed living in those communities, but we had a very tight community. I mean, we were very close, and we still meet and have reunions and things, you know, and we had a whole culture within the community, and we weren't, it was, when you grew up, you knew there was something wrong with what was going on, but you weren't really distressed about it. You just lived your life, you know, you lived your life as best you could, you know, and when we couldn't go to the theater on the Pike or the theater in Shirlington, because Shirlington was, Green Valley is right next to Shirlington, so that was where we kind of hung out. But there were a lot of places we couldn't go into. So we would go to Alexander, to the Carver Theater. We would go to, over in town to, what's the name of the theater? The Howard Theater, but the other one that's a movie theater, Yeah, Strand. Well, not the Strand. It was not Rand. Huh? Lincoln Theater. The Lincoln Theater. Thank you. And we went to the Howard Theater, and we spent a lot of time at the Howard, and we saw every, a black entertainer that now they fill up stadiums and stuff. But we saw them on the Howard Theater stage. It was like the Apollo of Washington, D.C. So our lives were not tragic, but they were very constricted. And for me, going to Our Lady Queen of Peace, and my mother having converted to Catholicism, we went to school in Alexandria. Me and my sisters and brothers went to school in Alexandria at St. Joseph's, and then when me and my two sisters went to St. Mary's Academy on Russell Road. So we were going outside of our community to go to school, but most of our friends went to the public schools, and having gone to St. Mary's Academy and being the only black person in my class, most of my friends, and it was the loneliest 4 years of my life. It's something that I guess most people who integrated schools have the same feeling, that it was new, so you didn't really meld that well, and the nuns really did nothing about it to make it better for you, So it was a very difficult time for everybody, plus everything else that was going on during the Civil Rights Movement. So that's, I could go on about what, Freedmen's Village and the churches that came over from Freedmen's Village, and the fact that I was born at Freedmen's Hospital, and Freedmen's Hospital was built for returning slaves. So I was born at Freedmen's, and a couple of my brothers and sisters were born at Freedmen's Hospital. You weren't born at Freedmen's Hospital, but because we were born at Freedmen's, which is now Howard University Hospital, because if you went to Virginia Hospital Center, which was then Arlington Hospital, to have a baby, even if you were in labor, they would send you. They wouldn't take you. You had to go. If you were black, you had to go to D.C. to have your child, and that was when I was old enough to have a child. So it wasn't that long ago. In historical terms, wasn't any time at all. So all these things happened within my lifetime. And a lot of the people that were living in Halls Hill, which is in North Arlington, Johnson Hill, which is in South Arlington, near where you turn off to 95 down at the end of the pike. And you've probably noticed the bridge that they put up, Freedmen's Bridge is up there now. A lot of those people came from the Pentagon area, from National Cemetery. They had Freedmen's Village over there, and a lot of the black people that came into Arlington or went into D.C. came from Freedmen's Village. And the churches, Mount Zion, I think Macedonia and Lomax, started. I know it was Mount Zion and Lomax. They started in Freedmen's Village, which was on the land where the National Cemetery is, and then I think Queen City was on the land where the Pentagon is now, right? And those people were moved off the Pentagon. And as I said in my notes, my neighborhood, Dunbar Homes, was demolished, and they put a community there that the people that lived there could not afford. And they're doing that. They're gentrifying all of Arlington. As a matter of fact, it was interesting to hear you say that about the real estate agents in 1920 or something, because that's all we have here now. They're always speculating in Arlington and the price. As a matter of fact, here's something really interesting, and I'll stop. I bought that house from that lady with the covenant on it for $19,000. Nixon came in, and the inflation took off. I sold the house for $69,000. 10 years later, I sold it for $69,000, and I bought a house for $94,000. But anyway, I sold that house for $19,000. Last couple of years ago, I was looking in the paper, and somebody bought that house for $700,000. I'm not kidding. So I used to live in that house, and I bought it for $19,000. But anyway, that's just a little sad. But anyway, it's just ridiculous. But anyway, that's my, story.
So our next speaker, after hearing people's different stories, and I was kind of asked, well, how does this all play out now? What does the history inform what our neighborhoods look like now? So I was talking to my friend Beth, and she's like, you got to talk to my friend Bev. And so Dr. Bev Jackson, she is a professor at American University, and this is what she teaches. And she's come here tonight to share with us.
So I'm just going to break all the rules. Can everybody hear me okay? Because I am not adept enough to flip. I may drop the mic. So I'm just going to put the mic down so we don't have any incidents. So I'm so super excited to be here tonight. Thank you both to my colleagues that spoke before me. It was pretty awesome. The great part about this conversation is to connect the dots. Connect the dots between historically what we've heard about this evening, and then what does that translate into present day. So there's some key takeaways that I wanted to start off with, and then we're going to kind of empirically have a little conversation about, so what does the wealth gap look like right now? What does health, well-being, food deserts, what does that look like when we talk about racialized and institutionalized racism that we talked about, that we've just heard about? So I want one thing for us to kind of start off with is the fact that racism is dynamic and ever-changing. And one of the things that we want to kind of keep in our mind's eye is that the critical aspect of racism is that we have to address the accumulation and incorporation of long-standing racialized practices. We've heard about practices tonight, right? Social, economic structures, but even more so, racial covenants, redlining. We'll talk a little bit about redlining. Institutionalized practices and discrimination. Now, the interesting piece is that racialized outcomes, which is what we see and know, do not have to have racist actors. We can actually hear about practices that inform some of these institutionalized racism. So, in 1954, and part of what I want to talk about is the fact that separate is never equal. We've heard constantly about separation, integration. Separate is never equal. In 1896, we had Plessy versus Ferguson, where the Supreme Court at the time rendered separate but equal constitutional. Now, fast forward to Brown in 1954, and Brown overturned Plessy, saying that separate but equal was unconstitutional. Now, Brown technically entered the courts in 1952. It was rendered in 54, and we actually had a part 2 to Brown as well in 1955. All this was telling us, though, is that separate but equal is never, ever, separate but equal is unconstitutional, and separate but equal is never, in fact, equal. So I want to give you a case study of Northwest Washington. We've heard about Arlington, which has been great, but the idea of racial covenants, very familiar to this area. So when we think of Northwest Washington, there were racially restricted deeds that were pretty common, row houses, townhouses, wherever you might find them, in the Bloomingdale area. How many of you are familiar with Bloomingdale in DC? Okay, so Bloomingdale is a case study that we're going to step through ever so quickly. Specifically in Bloomingdale, you actually had racially restricted covenants that were primarily on less established neighborhoods, and this was intentional in scope. They additionally also had active enforcement of these covenants that remained effective primarily until about 1907. So the windows that we're talking about, 1907, early 1920s, you see a lot of racial covenants, especially in Bloomingdale, with the objective of making sure you had communities that looked a certain way. You had a shade that you did not want to see in these communities. By February 1914, specifically in the Bloomingdale area, you had a lot of messaging that was happening during this window. You had a lot of linkages that were happening whereby you had Black occupancy that was declining. There were property values that were falling. This was a huge phenomenon that was happening during this period, to the point where you had legislative action. What we'll talk a little bit about is that legislative action and legislative drivers were hugely important when we talk about how you break down institutionalized racism. But more specifically, the linkage of Black occupancy with declining property values will become something of a self-fulfilling prophecy by the time you had your federal housing administration come into place with racial covenants in your 1930s. And this was a huge import during this period. Now, in August 1921, you had white neighbors literally signing legally binding agreements to restrict sale or rental of houses to white people. Now, I'll repeat that one more time. You had, in August 1921, white neighbors signing legally binding agreements to restrict the sale or rental of their houses to white people. So that's an interesting formula, right? So wait a minute. I thought you heard something completely different. Now, the interesting aspect of that is that this was intentional to make a neighborhood look a certain way. Now, in 1924, you had the DC Court of Appeals. They actually upheld the fact that you had whites actually ensuring that whites could not move in. Blacks said, guess what? We're doing it too. We will do the exact same thing. So you have the DC Court of Appeals uphold a covenant that said official segregation of schools and recreational facilities as precedent. So interestingly enough, this was now precedent. Further, you also had African Americans that were equally free to discriminate restrictive covenants that didn't violate their civil rights. So essentially, what you have a phenomenon right now is the creation of an intentional, separate but equal society. Now, I want to pause here because this is 1924. We're going to fast forward to 1954, 30 years to the Brown decision, but also to the Civil Rights Act of 1964. So Brown, of course, as shared previously, is that it overturned Plessy. But even more so, you had the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which essentially, what it did was that it discriminated it outlawed all discrimination based on race, color, religion, or sex, and it was across multiple domains. Now, when we think of the fact that we had Brown in 54, we also had the Civil Rights Act in 64, you also had other legislation. So the role of, I'd say, Supreme Court decisions, but also the role of legislative due process as well was mission critical. So in 2008, that marked the 14th anniversary of a key piece of legislation, the Fair Housing Act. So we've been talking tonight about the lens of, I'd say, racial covenants as a lens to look at institutionalized racism. So when we talk about institutionalized racism through the lens of racial covenants, Fair Housing Act was something that definitely of import for us to speak about tonight. Racial segregation. Racial segregation is essentially what the Fair Housing Act sought to remove. Racial segregation, it technically deprives communities of color from receiving equal access to quality education, employment, home ownership, and wealth accumulation. And that's how we connect the dots. We connect the dots when we think of institutionalized racism and its scope initially and kind of what that looks like present day. So essentially, when we think about residential segregation, African American home buyers and renters experience negative effects of housing discrimination from the beginning of the housing search. There's terminology that's actually kind of entrenched, I guess you could say, in the process of home buying and home searching at present. You have things called geographical stripping. You have information searches at the same time. So African Americans, for example, might be shown a number of housing properties in neighborhoods, but specifically just for African Americans, not for whites as well. And this is happening present day. And so FHA was 1968 to kind of give us some windows. 54, 55, 64, 68. Very active period from a civil rights phase, but intentionally with the objective of removing institutionalized racism, but at present, we still see a lot of these practices happening present day. Now, although the Fair Housing Act by itself was essentially the primary vehicle for the purposes of removing discrimination, it wasn't particularly effective. And the reason that I say that is because FHA was central in understanding how you remove approaches to segregation and better understanding aspects of what integration should look like. But when we talk about some empirical aspects of wealth gaps in food and health and well-being, we'll kind of see why it wasn't as effective. Now, essentially, spatial segregation is something that came out of FHA in 1968. Spatial segregation became the northern answer to Jim Crow laws. Jim Crow laws institutionalized racism. When we think of how we define Jim Crow, it's essentially institutionalized racism. And the response to institutionalized racism in our early 1900s, around the time where we saw racial covenants, was violence, mob violence especially. More specifically, I'm thinking of mob violence around riots. And when we think of FHA intentionally, in 1968, that was also a very tumultuous period. In fact, the riots, we had Dr. King's assassination that translated into multiple riots, but FHA was intentionally signed during that period, right around Dr. King's assassination. LBJ fast-forwarded the FHA in addition to development of the Kerner Commission. Now, when thinking of kind of what 68 meant and what that needed to look like, the Kerner Commission basically said, and this was a commission put together by LBJ essentially to look at what is happening in our neighborhoods. We know that we've had covenants in the 1920s, we've had covenants as early as 1900s. Fast forwarding to our 1924 is where we kind of paused. But what do we need to do as a nation to remove some of the institutionalized mechanisms of racism that we're seeing? So what LBJ put into place was the Kerner Commission. Essentially what the Kerner Commission ended up landing on is that we're moving towards two societies, one black, one white, separate and unequal, kind of going back to our primary theme. The Kerner Commission also translated what they were seeing and saying that policies would result in permanent division of the country, one largely Negro and poor, located in central cities, and the other predominantly white and affluent, located in suburbs. Essentially what the objective of the racial covenant sought to translate into, unfortunately, the Kerner Commission also shared as well. Now, the Fair Housing Act did, although it wasn't as effective as we would have liked it to have been, it did help to put into place seeds of residential mobility. And that was something that was a little different that we hadn't previously seen before. It did also succeed in actually giving victims of housing discrimination legal and administrative recourse. So you never had legal recourse before. So you had your racial covenants, but what could you truly do about them? Absolutely nothing. So housing discrimination, racial segregation practices in cities, you actually finally had a voice. You had an opportunity to be able to have some sort of administrative, a business process to actually fight it. Now, FHA, the Civil Rights Act of '64, Brown versus the Board of Education, there were discriminatory preferences that we can't deny based on kind of what we've heard from colleagues earlier, but also too, and a little piece of what we've discussed tonight. And sociologists and I'd say multiple persons that kind of study this work really talk about the fact that non-segregation as a term, as a concept, implies both the right of people to remain where they are and the elimination of restrictions on moving to other areas. That was part of the framework and the sentiment behind this idea of racial covenants and the lens through which we think about redlining and also institutionalized racism. Geographic steering, racial steering of information. These are key terms when we think of this lens of institutionalized racism around the idea of racialized segregation. Now, all of this kind of rolls up into this idea of systemic racism. Among the things that I would say would be most important to kind of take away is that this history, there's a great poet / essayist, George Satiana, that says, if we don't know our history, we may in fact repeat it, right? So we need to know our history. The reality is that the systemic racism that we've talked about tonight, and even some of the progress steps and the legislative drivers that I shared with you ever so briefly, is that empirically when we look at things like the wealth gap is the first place to start. On average, when we talk about median incomes between persons of color and non-person of color community, the numbers are extensive. So, perfect case in point, the black wealth gap has not recovered from the Great Recession. In 2007, and some of this data, there's Center for American Progress that's great, there's Pew Research Center, a lot of entities that do some really great work about kind of deconstructing, kind of peeling back the onion a bit in terms of what do we mean by disparities and inequality. But when we define systemic inequality, there's some domains that would be helpful for us to engage. So the first of which, black wealth gap has not recovered from the Great Recession. African Americans own approximately 1/10 of the wealth of white Americans. Now, when we think of median wealth, and we actually attach some numbers, in some 2016 data, the median wealth for black and Hispanic families was $17,600 and $20,700. That was respectively. The median wealth of white families. Anybody want to guess what the median wealth for white families may have been in 2016?
145,000.
What was that? Much higher. I thought I heard it in this corner.
100,000. 150.
But, no, actually 171. 171. So let me repeat the previous numbers. So African Americans and Hispanics, we're below, we're at 20,000, if not less. Whites, 171,000. And primarily what we're talking about though from a historical space is that African Americans and communities of color, because that's really what we're talking about. Communities of color have faced systemic challenges in narrowing the wealth gap. And a lot of this is due to socioeconomic variables. So we're talking about employment. We're talking about an ability to save. We're talking about owning. We're talking about variables that translate into you being unable to build wealth. African Americans have fewer assets and are less likely to be homeowners. And we've heard why. We've heard a lot of reasons as to why. Unable to primarily own businesses. And that translates into other things. That bleeds into retirement. That bleeds into savings. So you have a sense as to why the wealth gap is as large as what it is. Additionally, there are other variables that we need to think about. What about poverty? What about that? So poverty rates for African Americans and Native American individuals are nearly double that of the poverty rate. So not even doing a comparative analysis of by subpopulation and demographic, but just by the poverty rate, you'll find that poverty rates for African Americans and Native Americans are nearly double. Additionally, when we look at unemployment rates, there's a huge disparity when we look at African Americans compared to white Americans. A lot of this are based on seeds of institutionalized racism. Another domain that is of import is when we talk about education. Now we know technically, in 1954, Brown said we're going to integrate schools. Well, in reality, we know that there are actually still, to this day, school jurisdictions that are under desegregation mandate. My dissertation was on Brown versus the Board of Education, and literally, between 1970 and about 1980, we had our most progress. And now we've been regressing ever since. So quite simply, children of color are more likely to attend high poverty schools than their counterparts, and they're also more likely to be in schools with children that look like them. Only out of, let's say, 1 of 20 white students attend a high poverty school. So kind of rewind. Children of color are more likely to attend high poverty schools than their white counterparts. The average African American child attends a school with 65% poverty rate. However, only 1 out of 20 white students attend a high poverty school. So education and learning is another domain that we need to consider for systemic racism. So wealth gap, education and learning, and the other domain that I want to bring to you guys tonight before closing is this idea of well-being. This idea of well-being and food and health. The reality is that nearly 15% of African American children lack insurance. That's something that we don't really kind of think about. When we think about the racial covenants and we think about institutionalized racism, we need to also think about kind of from a contemporary space, what does that mean? What does that look like? When we think of asthma rates are also higher in African American children than other populations. Part of the big issue when we think of institutionalized racism is it translated into an inability for African American communities and primarily communities of color to have access to resources, to infrastructure, and environmental justice. And that is partly why the contemporary conversation is very much alive. Additionally, when we think of racial disparities in terms of child mortality for the African American community, another domain area whereby there's a huge gap in disparity. So bridging the historical with the contemporary is mission critical primarily through the lens of understanding our history and knowing our history, but even more so, getting a better sense of how those variables historically translate into how our contemporary spaces were really impacted. If we don't know our history, we are destined in part to repeat it moving forward.